Hey there, friends. Tonight, I thought we could explore some beautiful Greek myths together. 3 stories about journeys into the underworld that reveal the eternal struggles between light and darkness, love and loss, hope and despair. We'll follow a young goddess torn between 2 worlds. Listen to a musician whose love was so powerful it could move the stones of hell itself. And witness the quiet dignity of a man who found meaning in endless repetition. If this is your first time hearing these ancient tales, I'd love to know. Feel free to share in the comments below. And if you're enjoying our journey together, a little heart would mean the world to me, and help these timeless stories find their way to others who might need them tonight. So grab your coziest blanket and maybe a warm cup of tea. Let's begin with Persephone, picking flowers in her beautiful sunlit meadow. In the beginning, before the world knew seasons, there was only endless spring. The earth bloomed without pause under the watchful eyes of the gods, and among them Demeter tended her domain with the fierce devotion of a mother protecting her child. She was the goddess of harvest, of grain that bent golden in eternal sunshine, of flowers that never knew the touch of frost. But her greatest treasure was not the endless bounty she brought to mortals below. It was her daughter. Persephone moved through the world like laughter made flesh, her feet barely touching the ground as she danced through meadows that seemed to bloom brighter at her approach. The gods had given her a gift that even they envied. Wherever she walked, life followed. Flowers opened their faces to her instead of the sun. Trees stretched their branches toward her voice. Even the stones seemed softer beneath her sandals, as if the earth itself recognized something precious and chose to cushion her steps. But in the realm below, where shadows gathered like silk curtains, and the dead wandered in eternal twilight, another god watched and waited. Hades ruled his kingdom with the solitude of one who has never known companionship. His throne carved from obsidian, his crown wrought from metals that never saw daylight. He was not cruel, this lord of the underworld, but he was desperately, achingly alone. The dead came to him, yes, but they were already lost to themselves, their memories fading like morning mist. They could not see him, not truly. They moved through his realm like sleepwalkers, and he had become invisible even to himself, a shadow ruling shadows. Until the day he looked up through a crack in the earth and saw her, Persephone, laughing as she chased a butterfly through a meadow, her hair catching sunlight like spun gold. In that moment, something shifted in the cosmic order. The god of the dead, who had never known want because he had never seen what he was missing, felt his heart crack open like winter ice meeting spring water. Above, Persephone had no knowledge of the eyes watching her from below. She woke each morning in her mother's palace, where marble columns rose like frozen waterfalls and gardens stretched beyond the horizon. Demeter would kiss her daughter's forehead and send her out to play, never imagining that such simple joy could catch the attention of darker forces. "Where will you go today, little seed?" Demeter would ask, using the pet name that made Persephone wrinkle her nose. "I'm not little," Persephone would protest, though she was still young by the standards of gods, still discovering the extent of her own power. "And I'm going to the meadow by the silver stream. The narcissus flowers there have been calling to me in my dreams." Demeter smiled at this. Her daughter had always been sensitive to the needs of growing things, able to hear what others could not. It was a gift that would serve her well when she inherited dominion over the green and growing world. So Persephone would set out each day, sometimes alone, sometimes with the wood nymphs who adored her, always returning before sunset with flowers in her hair and stories on her lips. She would tell her mother about the deer that had let her braid ribbons in its antlers, about the creek that had sung her a song, about the way certain flowers seemed to glow when she hummed to them. What she did not tell her mother, because she did not know how to put it into words, was the strange restlessness that had begun to visit her dreams. Sometimes she woke with the taste of pomegranate on her tongue, though no such fruit grew in her mother's eternal spring. Sometimes she dreamed of walking through halls carved from darkness itself, her footsteps echoing in ways that made her chest tight with an emotion she could not name. The dreams troubled her, but not enough to keep her from her daily wanderings. If anything, they made her more eager to lose herself in the simple pleasure of sunshine and growing things, as if the brightness could chase away whatever shadows visited her sleep. It was on such a morning that she made her way to the meadow of narcissus flowers, her favorite place in all the world. The flowers grew there in impossible abundance, their white petals seeming to capture and hold the light. She had discovered the meadow as a child, and it remained her secret sanctuary, unknown even to the nymphs who followed her elsewhere. The air was sweet with the scent of blooming things as she approached, her bare feet silent on the grass. She could hear the silver stream chattering to itself, and beyond that, the distant song of larks. Everything was exactly as it should be, peaceful and perfect, and eternally the same. But as she knelt among the narcissus flowers, reaching for a bloom that seemed larger and more luminous than the rest, the ground beneath her began to tremble. At first, she thought it was merely the earth responding to her touch. Sometimes her power worked that way, making the soil rich and eager beneath her hands. But the trembling grew stronger, and she could hear something else now, beneath the birdsong and the babbling stream. A sound like distant thunder, or perhaps the grinding of enormous stones. She tried to stand, but the flower seemed to pulse with an inner light, drawing her hand forward as if it contained some essential magic she needed to claim. Her fingers closed around the stem, just as the earth split open with a sound like the world breaking in half. From the crack in the ground came darkness given form, not the gentle darkness of night, but something older and deeper, shot through with veins of silver and gold, like precious metals running through obsidian. And from that darkness stepped a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. He was tall, this stranger, with skin pale as marble and hair dark as the space between stars. He wore robes that seemed to be cut from the night sky itself, and when he looked at her, his eyes held depths she could not fathom. But it was not his otherworldly beauty that made her heart stutter. It was the expression on his face, a mixture of longing and sorrow so profound it seemed to echo in her bones. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice carried the weight of stone and centuries. "But I cannot wait any longer." Before she could speak, before she could even think to run, the ground beneath her feet gave way entirely. She fell, not into empty air, but into those strange dark depths, the narcissus flower still clutched in her hand. Her last glimpse of the world above was her mother's meadow, bright and peaceful under the eternal sun, growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. The descent felt both endless and instantaneous. One moment she was tumbling through darkness, her hair whipping around her face, her heart hammering with terror and confusion. The next, she was standing in a vast hall carved from black stone, torches flickering in sconces that seemed to burn without fuel. The stranger, she knew now that he must be Hades, lord of the underworld, though she had never seen him before, stood watching her with those unfathomable eyes. He had not moved to catch her as she fell, but somehow she had landed softly, as if the air itself had cushioned her arrival. "You brought me here," she said, her voice smaller than she intended. It was not a question. Yes. He did not try to justify it, did not offer excuses or explanations. The simple honesty of it was somehow more unsettling than any lie might have been. She looked around the great hall, taking in the impossible architecture, the way the ceiling disappeared into darkness above, the doors that led to corridors she could not see the end of. Everything was beautiful in its way, but it was a cold beauty, like looking at stars from a great distance. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something. "Because I am alone," he said. "Because in all the eons of my existence, I have never seen anything as lovely as you dancing in your mother's meadow. Because I am selfish enough to steal sunlight and brave enough to face your mother's wrath if it means I do not have to spend eternity in solitude." The honesty of it stole her breath. She had expected threats, perhaps, or commands. She had not expected this raw vulnerability, this admission that made him seem less like a god and more like a creature in pain. "My mother," she said, the words a whisper. "She will be looking for me." "Yes," Hades agreed. "She will tear the world apart looking for you. And when she finds you—" He shrugged, a gesture that spoke of acceptance and resignation. "Perhaps it will be worth it, to have known what it feels like not to be alone." Above them, though Persephone could not know it yet, Demeter had indeed begun to tear the world apart. The moment her daughter failed to return at sunset, she knew something was terribly wrong. Persephone had never, not once in all her young life, forgotten to come home. Demeter searched first with hope, calling her daughter's name across meadows and through forests. She questioned every nymph, every dryad, every creature that might have seen Persephone pass. But as the hours stretched into days, hope curdled into panic, and panic into rage. The goddess of the harvest began to withhold her gifts. If the world could not keep her daughter safe, then the world would learn what it meant to lose the things it took for granted. Crops withered in the fields. Fruit rotted on the vine. The eternal spring faltered, and for the first time in creation's history, leaves began to turn brown and fall. Mortals looked up at the sky in confusion and growing fear. Their offerings to the gods doubled, then tripled, but still the crops failed. Children began to go hungry, the elderly grew weak. And still Demeter searched, her grief and rage leaving a trail of barren earth in her wake. Below, in the realm of shadows, Persephone felt the change like a physical ache in her chest. She could sense her mother's pain, could feel the world above growing cold and hungry. It was a torment worse than any prison could have been. But Hades, to her surprise, did not keep her locked away. He showed her his kingdom, walking beside her through halls filled with wonders she could never have imagined. There were gardens here, though they grew in eternal twilight, their flowers blooming in shades of silver and deep purple. There were libraries containing the stories of every soul who had ever lived. There were pools of water so clear they seemed to hold captured starlight. "It is beautiful," she admitted reluctantly as they stood beside a lake where silver fish swam in lazy circles. "But it is not alive." "No," Hades agreed. "Nothing here is truly alive. That is why—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "That is why I needed you. You carry life in your very breath. Even here, the flowers turn toward you instead of the eternal twilight." It was true. She had not noticed it at first, but everywhere they walked, the strange plants of the underworld seemed to brighten slightly, their petals opening wider, their stems growing straighter. Even in this realm of death, her presence brought something new. "But what of my mother?" she asked. "What of the world above? I can feel it dying." Hades closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked less like a god and more like a man carrying a burden too heavy to bear. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too. Every mortal who dies from hunger or cold because of your mother's grief, they come to me. Their blood is on my hands as much as hers." "Then let me go." "I cannot." The words seemed torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "I have lived forever in solitude, Persephone. I have ruled this realm since time began, and in all that time I have never known companionship, never known—" he struggled with the word— "love. Ask me to cut out my heart, and I will do it more readily than I will let you leave." She stared at him, this god who had stolen her from everything she knew, who was causing suffering beyond measure, and yet who spoke of love with such desperate honesty that she could not bring herself to hate him. "You do not love me," she said gently. "You love the idea of me. You love the hope that someone might ease your loneliness. But love requires knowing someone, and you do not know me at all." He flinched as if she had struck him, but he did not argue. Perhaps because, in his heart, he knew she was right. Days passed, or what felt like days, in a realm where time moved strangely. Hades did not confine her, did not force his attention upon her. He simply shared his world, showing her its wonders and its sorrows, with the desperate hope of someone trying to prove that his cage was gilded enough to be worth the loss of freedom. And slowly, against her will and better judgment, Persephone began to understand him. She saw how he cared for the souls in his charge, ensuring that each found their proper place in the afterlife. She watched him sit for hours beside the river of forgetfulness, his face reflecting a grief so profound it seemed to echo through the very stones of his palace. She began to see that his loneliness was not mere self-pity, but a cosmic wound that had shaped every moment of his existence. "How long have you been alone?" she asked one evening, as they walked through a grove of silver trees that chimed softly in the windless air. "Since the beginning," he said. "When Zeus divided the world among us 3 brothers, he took the sky, Poseidon took the sea, and I took the realm of the dead. It was just, perhaps. My temperament suited the work, but justice and happiness are not the same thing. Have you never tried to visit the world above?" He smiled, but there was no joy in it. "What place is there for the Lord of the dead among the living? I am the God they fear to name, the one they pray never to meet. Children learn to whisper when they speak of me. When mortals see me, they know their time has come. I am the ending of every story, Persephone. I am not welcome at weddings or festivals or any of the celebrations that make life sweet." The sadness in his voice made her chest tight with unexpected sympathy. She had never thought of it that way. How isolating it must be to be the god everyone feared, the one whose very presence meant loss and endings. "But you are also the god of justice," she said softly. "The one who ensures that good souls find peace and evil ones face judgment. Without you, death would be chaos. Without you, the cycle of life would be meaningless." He stopped walking and stared at her as if she had spoken in a language he did not recognize. "You do not fear me," he said, and it was not a question, but a statement of wonder. "I should," she admitted. "But no, I do not fear you. I am angry with you, yes. I grieve for my mother and for the world above, but I do not fear you." "Why?" She considered this, walking slowly beside the chiming trees, breathing air that tasted of silver and starlight. "Because I have seen how gently you tend the souls who come to you. Because I have watched you grieve for every mortal who dies before their time. Because you could have taken me by force, but instead you try to win me with beauty and honest words. You are not the monster the stories make you out to be, Hades. You are just lonely." They walked in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence than before. The desperate edge had gone out of it, replaced by something deeper and more fragile. That night, Persephone dreamed of her mother's garden, but for the first time since her arrival in the underworld, she also dreamed of silver trees and halls carved from starlight. When she woke, she found a pomegranate beside her bed, its skin deep red as garnets, its scent rich and inviting. She had eaten nothing since her arrival, sustained by the strange magic of the underworld itself. But the pomegranate called to her with a hunger she had not known she possessed. Without thinking, she cracked it open and ate 6 of its ruby seeds, their juice sweet and tart on her tongue. Only after she had swallowed did she remember the old stories, that those who ate the food of the dead were bound to the underworld forever. Hades found her sitting in the garden, the empty pomegranate rind in her hands, tears streaming down her face. "Did you know?" she asked. "Did you leave it there knowing what it would do?" "No," he said, and she believed him. The horror on his face was too genuine to be feigned. "Persephone, no, I would not bind you here through trickery. If you stay, I want it to be because you choose to stay, not because you have no choice." "Then why do I not feel trapped?" she whispered. "Why does part of me feel relieved?" He knelt beside her, careful not to touch her without permission. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "because part of you was already choosing to stay." She looked up at him through her tears, this god who had stolen her and yet, somehow, impossibly, begun to win her heart. "My mother will never forgive me." "Your mother loves you. She will find a way to forgive anything if it means having you back." Above them, as if summoned by their words, the ceiling of the underworld began to crack. Light poured through the fissures, not the gentle golden light of eternal spring, but something fiercer and more desperate. The air itself began to vibrate with divine power. Demeter had found them. The goddess of the harvest descended through the crack like avenging lightning, her hair streaming behind her, her eyes blazing with a mother's rage. Where her feet touched the stone floor of Hades' hall, flowers bloomed. But these were not the gentle flowers of spring. These were angry blooms, thorny and bright, that withered as quickly as they appeared. "Give me back my daughter!" The words shook the foundations of the underworld, sent ripples through the river Styx, made even the souls of the dead look up in wonder. Hades stepped in front of Persephone, not to shield her from her mother, but to shield Demeter from the sight of her daughter's tears, tears that might be misunderstood, that might fuel rage beyond reason. "She ate the pomegranate seeds," he said simply. "She is bound here now." Demeter's scream of anguish could have split mountains. "You tricked her! You used foul magic to—" "No." Persephone's voice cut through her mother's rage like a blade. She stepped out from behind Hades, her chin raised, her eyes bright with tears, but steady with resolve. "Mother, no. He did not trick me." Demeter stared at her daughter, as if seeing a stranger. "Then why?" "Because I chose to eat them," Persephone said softly. "Because part of me did not want to leave. The silence that followed was deafening. Demeter's face went through a dozen emotions: disbelief, betrayal, heartbreak, and finally a grief so profound it made the stones themselves weep. "You would choose him over me?" she whispered. "You would choose this realm of shadows over the world I made for you?" "I would choose not to have to choose at all," Persephone replied, her voice breaking. "I love you, Mother. I love the world above, the gardens we tended together, the feeling of sunshine on my face. But I also—" She looked at Hades, standing silent and stricken beside them. "I also love the peace I have found here. I love the way the souls here need tending. I love the beauty that exists even in darkness." She took a shuddering breath. "And I love him, though I never meant to. I love his loneliness and his gentleness and the way he tends to things that no one else cares about. I do not want to have to choose between the two halves of my heart." Demeter closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, centuries of divine wisdom looked out from them. She had been a mother before she was a goddess, and mothers, even divine ones, sometimes had to make choices that broke their hearts in order to heal them. "Zeus," she called, her voice carrying to the far reaches of Olympus, "come and mediate this dispute. Come and find a solution that does not require a daughter to choose between her mother and her heart." The king of the gods appeared with thunder and lightning, his presence filling the hall with crackling energy. He looked at the tableau before him: the grieving mother, the guilty lover, the torn daughter, and his expression was uncharacteristically thoughtful. "The pomegranate seeds bind you here," he said to Persephone. "6 seeds, eaten of your own free will. But perhaps the binding need not absolute." He gestured, and the air shimmered with divine possibility. 6 months of the year you will spend here, in the underworld, as queen of the dead. 6 months you will spend above, bringing spring and summer to the world. The seasons will turn as they never have before, death and rebirth in eternal cycle, the world learning to love both the green time and the quiet time. Persephone felt something settle in her chest, a rightness she had not dared hope for. "Half of my heart to each realm," she said softly. "Half of my life to each love." Demeter wept, but they were tears of relief as much as sorrow. "The world will hunger in the months you are gone from it. And in the months I am present, it will feast," Persephone replied. "The contrast will make both sweeter." Hades said nothing, but when Persephone took his hand, his fingers closed around hers with desperate gratitude. Half the year was more than he had ever dared dream of. Half the year was everything. And so the first winter came to the world, and with it, the first true understanding of seasons. When Persephone descended to take her place as queen of the underworld, the leaves turned gold and red before falling. The air grew crisp and clean, and mortals learned the beauty of quiet months, of reflection and rest. When she returned to the world above, spring exploded from the earth with joy too long contained. Flowers bloomed brighter, fruit grew sweeter, and everything that lived celebrated the return of the goddess who had learned to love both light and shadow. In the underworld, Hades waited for her return with patience, learned from eons of solitude, but sweetened now by hope. In the world above, Demeter learned to let her daughter go with grace, knowing that love sometimes meant sharing what you treasured most. And Persephone, queen of two realms, walked between worlds with her heart full and her purpose clear. She had learned that love was not about choosing, but about expanding. She had learned that sometimes the most beautiful stories were the ones that refused to end with simple answers. The narcissus flower she had picked on that first day still grew in her underworld garden, blooming year-round in defiance of the rules that governed the realm above. It was a reminder that some things, once touched by love, transcend the boundaries others would place upon them. In the quiet halls below, where shadows danced like silk and silver fish swam in starlit pools, love had found a way to make even death beautiful. And in the turning of the seasons, in the eternal dance between light and shadow, spring and winter, the world learned a new kind of story. One where endings were just beginnings in disguise, and where love, patient and enduring, could bridge even the gap between the realm of the living and the land of the dead. As night settles deeper around us, we leave Persephone in her dual kingdom, tending to souls who need her gentle touch, and dreaming of the spring days to come. But the underworld holds more stories yet, and another tale waits in the shadows. A story of music so beautiful it could soften the heart of death itself, and a love so profound it dared to challenge the very order of existence. In the days when music was still young, and the gods walked closer to the earth, Apollo looked down upon the world and saw that it lacked something essential. Mortals had learned to speak, to laugh, to cry, but they had not yet learned to sing in ways that could touch the very fabric of creation. So the god of light and prophecy chose a mortal woman, Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, and from their union came a child who would carry music itself in his voice. They named him Orpheus, and from his first cry, the world knew it had gained something extraordinary. Birds fell silent when he wailed as a baby, not from annoyance, but from wonder, as if they recognized a voice that could teach them new songs. Flowers turned toward him instead of the sun. Even the wind seemed to pause and listen when he made the small sounds that babies make, sensing that this child would grow into something the cosmos had been waiting for. But the gods, in their wisdom and their cruelty, rarely give gifts without complications woven into them like thorns hidden in roses. As Orpheus grew, so did his gift. His mother taught him the patterns of poetry, the way words could be woven together to create meaning beyond their individual parts. His father gave him a lyre made from the shell of a tortoise and the horns of a sacred bull, its strings spun from starlight and morning mist. When the boy first drew his fingers across those strings, the mountains leaned in to listen. He did not play music. Music flowed through him like water through a riverbed, natural and inevitable. When he sang of summer, flowers bloomed out of season. When he sang of rain, clouds gathered in clear skies. When he sang of love, hearts that had been closed for years cracked open like seeds in spring soil. The other mortals watched him with a mixture of wonder and unease. They came to hear him play, drawn by something they could not name, but they kept their distance too. There was something in his music that was almost too beautiful to bear, something that made them remember losses they had forgotten and dream of things that might never be. "He sings the way gods must feel," whispered an old woman after hearing him play at a village festival. "No wonder it hurts so much to listen." Orpheus himself was unaware of his effect on others. To him, music was simply the way he breathed, the way he understood the world. He saw melodies in the flight patterns of birds, heard harmonies in the sound of wind through leaves, felt rhythm in his own heartbeat. The lyre was just an extension of his hands, and his voice was simply the truest way he knew to speak. He wandered the world in those early years, learning songs from every corner of creation. He learned the lullabies that stars sang to sleeping planets. He learned the work songs that mountains hummed as they grew taller. He learned the love songs that flowers whispered to the bees that courted them. But for all the music that flowed through him, for all the beauty he could create with voice and string, Orpheus felt a strange emptiness. His music could move stones to tears and make wild animals lie down like lambs. But it could not fill the hollow space in his own chest, a space that seemed shaped for something he had not yet found. That changed the day he saw Eurydice dancing in a meadow outside the city of Thrace. She moved like music made visible, her bare feet barely touching the grass, her arms tracing patterns in the air that seemed to echo melodies he had never heard but somehow knew by heart. Her hair fell in dark waves down her back, and when she turned and saw him watching from the edge of the clearing, her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "You're the musician everyone talks about," she said, not stopping her dance, but changing its rhythm to match the quickening of his pulse. "They say you can make rivers run backward with your songs." "I've never tried," Orpheus admitted, finding his voice smaller than usual. "Would you like me to?" She laughed, and the sound was clear as temple bells. "I'd rather you played something I could dance to, something happy. Everyone says your music is beautiful, but they also say it makes them sad." He had never thought of his music as sad, but looking at her, this creature of light and motion who seemed to embody joy itself, he realized she was right. His songs carried the weight of all the longing in the world, all the beauty that could be glimpsed but never quite grasped. So he played for her, but differently than he had ever played before. He let her movement guide his melody, let her laughter season his harmonies. For the first time in his life, his music was not a solitary conversation with the cosmos, but a dialogue, a dance between two souls learning the steps together. When the song ended, she was standing close enough that he could see flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. "Eurydice," she said, and her name in his mouth tasted like honey and summer rain. From that day forward, they were inseparable. Where Orpheus had wandered alone before, now he and Eurydice traveled together, she dancing to his songs, he playing melodies inspired by her movement. She taught him that music could be joyful as well as profound, that beauty did not always have to carry the weight of sadness to be meaningful. They performed at weddings and festivals, in royal courts and village squares. But their most treasured moments were the quiet ones, evenings by their campfire when he would play softly and she would dance just for him, her shadow wavering against the flames like a spirit of happiness given form. "Will you marry me?" he asked her one night, as they sat beneath stars that seemed to pulse in time with his lyre. "Only if you promise to keep playing," she said, curling against his shoulder. "I want to dance to your music for the rest of my life." They were wed on a day when even the weather seemed to celebrate, with sunshine that felt like blessing, and breezes that carried the scent of 1,000 flowers. Orpheus played the wedding song, his voice soaring with happiness so pure it made the gods themselves pause in their eternal business to listen. But the fates, those ancient weavers of destiny, had already begun to pull at different threads. The wedding celebration lasted 3 days, with guests traveling from distant lands to witness the union of the world's greatest musician and the woman who had taught him joy. On the final evening, as the last dancers were making their way home, and the torches burned low, Eurydice walked to the river to wash the flower petals from her hair. She was humming one of Orpheus's melodies, her bare feet careful on the moonlit stones, when she stepped on what she thought was a fallen branch. But the branch moved, coiling and striking before she could react, and she felt the sharp burn of a viper's fangs in her ankle. The poison worked quickly, as snake venom does. By the time her cry brought Orpheus running to the riverbank, she was already struggling to breathe, her face pale as winter moonlight. "Sing," she whispered as he knelt beside her, her hand clutching his with fading strength. "Sing me something beautiful." So he sang, pouring every ounce of his power into his voice, singing of life and healing and love stronger than death itself. For a moment, just a moment, color returned to her cheeks and her breathing steadied. But some poisons are beyond even the reach of divine music, and she slipped away from him like water through cupped hands, her last breath a sigh that sounded almost like his name. The silence that followed her death was unlike any quiet Orpheus had ever known. It was not the peaceful hush that fell when his music ended, but a hollowness that seemed to swallow sound itself. For the first time in his life, he could not hear the music that flowed beneath all things. He carried her body to their marriage bed and lay beside her, his lyre clutched to his chest like a shield against grief. For 7 days and 7 nights he did not move, did not speak, did not play a single note. The world around him fell into a strange quiet, as if all of creation was holding its breath, waiting for the music to return. But when it came back, it was changed. The first song he played after Eurydice's death made stones weep tears of blood. The second called up a wind that stripped every leaf from every tree for miles around. The third broke every heart within hearing, mortal and immortal alike, until even the gods begged him to stop. "She is gone," his mother Calliope said gently, appearing beside him as he sat in the ruins of what had been their home. "My son, you must let her go." "I cannot," he said, his voice raw from singing sorrow. "The music is all wrong without her. Every melody I play is missing notes only she could provide. Then you must learn new songs." "No," he stood, his lyre catching the last light of sunset. "I will go where she has gone. I will bring her back." Calliope's face went pale with understanding. "Orpheus, no mortal has ever returned from the underworld. The path down is a path meant for the dead alone." "Then I will die trying," he said simply. "What is life without music, and what is music without her?" Before his mother could stop him, he began to walk, his bare feet finding paths that were not quite paths, following currents in the air that only he could sense. His music had always connected him to the hidden ways of the world, and now it led him toward the secret places where the realm of the living touched the realm of the dead. The journey to the underworld took him through landscapes that existed at the edges of reality. He walked across plains where the grass was silver and black, through forests where the trees grew downward into the sky, along shores where dark water lapped at beaches made of crushed pearls and bone. With every step he played his lyre, but these were not songs of sorrow anymore. These were songs of determination, melodies that carved a path through impossible terrain, harmonies that held his mortal flesh together as he moved deeper into realms where the living were never meant to go. The entrance to Hades appeared before him as a cave mouth that breathed with its own rhythm, exhaling air that smelled of copper and dust and things long buried. Two figures flanked the opening: Charon, the ferryman who carried souls across the river of death, and Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded the gates. Both had been placed there to prevent exactly what Orpheus was attempting. No living soul was permitted to enter the realm of the dead. It was a law older than the gods themselves. But when Orpheus began to play, both guardian and hound froze where they stood. The music he played was unlike anything that had ever echoed in those shadow-touched halls. It spoke of love that refused to accept endings, of hope that burned even in the deepest darkness, of a heart that would rather break completely than live with only half its song. Cerberus, the terrible three-headed beast that could tear apart armies, lay down like a puppy and closed all 6 eyes. Charon, ancient and stern, found tears on his weathered cheeks for the first time in millennia. "Pass," the ferryman whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "But know that the path you walk leads only to greater sorrow." Orpheus nodded his thanks and stepped into the boat that carried souls to their final rest. As they glided across the dark water, he continued to play, his music rippling outward through the realm of the dead like light through deep water. The souls that wandered the gray shores of death stopped their eternal walking to listen. For the first time since their deaths, they remembered what it felt like to feel, to hope, to love. Some wept tears they had thought themselves beyond shedding. Others reached toward the boat with hands that longed to touch something beautiful one more time. Even the judges of the dead paused in their eternal work, their stern faces softening as the melody washed over them. The fires of torment dimmed, and the rivers of punishment ran more gently, as if the whole underworld had fallen under the spell of a single mortal's love. At last, the boat touched the shore of the palace itself, where Hades ruled his dark kingdom from a throne carved from a single massive diamond, its facets catching and holding the light of 1,000 torches. Beside him sat Persephone, queen of the underworld, her face bearing the strange double nature of one who belonged to both life and death. Orpheus walked into the great hall with his head held high, his lyre singing a song that made the very stones of the palace hum in harmony. He had come too far and risked too much to be turned away by fear now. "Lord Hades," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space, "I have come for my wife." The god of the dead studied him with eyes like chips of obsidian. "Your wife is dead, mortal. She belongs to my realm now." "She belongs with me," Orpheus replied simply, and began to play the song he had been composing throughout his impossible journey, a song that told the story of his love for Eurydice, of their brief happiness, of the emptiness her loss had carved in his soul. The music filled the hall like water filling a vessel, touching every corner, every shadow, every hidden space. It spoke of love so profound it could not be contained by the boundaries between life and death. It sang of devotion that refused to accept impossibility, of hope that burned brightest in the deepest darkness. As he played, something extraordinary happened. The court of the dead began to remember what it meant to be alive. Hades himself felt tears on his cheeks, tears he had not shed since the day he realized his kingdom would always be a place of endings, never beginnings. Persephone wept for all the springs she had left behind, all the flowers that bloomed and died while she ruled in shadow. The spirits that attended the court felt their hearts, long thought dissolved with their mortal flesh, beating once again with remembered rhythm. The very air seemed to shimmer with the possibility that some endings might, after all, be transformed into new beginnings. When the last note died away, the silence that followed was different from any that had ever graced the underworld. It was not the silence of endings, but the silence of held breath, of a world waiting to see if the impossible might become possible. "Why?" Hades asked, his voice barely audible. "Why risk everything for one mortal woman when the world is full of others who could love you?" "Because she is not just one woman," Orpheus said, his hands still resting on his lyre strings. "She is the melody that gives meaning to all my other music. She is the dance that makes my songs complete. Without her, I am not a musician. I am just a man making noise in the darkness." Persephone leaned forward, her eyes bright with understanding. "And you would risk your own life to bring her back? My life without her is not really life at all," Orpheus replied. "It is just waiting." The queen of the underworld looked at her husband, and something passed between them, an understanding born of their own love story, their own knowledge of what it meant to choose love despite impossible circumstances. "Very well," Hades said at last, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. Orpheus felt his heart leap like a bird taking flight, but the god raised his hand for silence. "But," Hades continued, "there are conditions. You may lead her back to the world of the living, but you must not look back at her until you both stand in full sunlight. You must trust that she follows. Trust that love alone will guide her steps behind yours. Can you do this?" It seemed such a simple thing, such a small price to pay for the return of everything that mattered. Orpheus nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. A door opened in the wall behind the throne, and through it came a figure that made his soul sing with recognition. Eurydice walked toward him slowly, her form translucent as morning mist, her feet making no sound on the stone floor. But her eyes, her beautiful, warm eyes, were exactly as he remembered them. "My love," she said, her voice like an echo from across a vast distance, "you came for me." "Always," he whispered, fighting every instinct that wanted him to turn and look at her properly, to confirm that she was real and whole and return to him. "I will always come for you." So began the strangest journey of Orpheus's life. He walked ahead, playing his lyre to light their way through the winding passages that led from death back to life. Behind him, he could hear the whisper of footsteps that might have been Eurydice's, but he could not be certain. The underworld played tricks with sound, made echoes where there should be silence, created silence where footsteps should fall. "Are you there?" he called softly as they navigated a particularly dark passage. "I am here," came her voice, though it seemed to come from farther away than it should. "Keep playing, my love. Your music lights the way." So he played, pouring every ounce of his love into melodies that carved a path through shadow. He played songs of their first meeting, of their wedding day, of all the quiet evenings by their campfire when her dance had made his music whole. He played promises that he would love her forever, that they would have more time together, that their story would not end with her death by a dark river. The path grew brighter as they climbed, and Orpheus began to smell things that belonged to the world of the living, pine sap and morning dew, the green scent of new grass, the sweetness of wildflowers. His heart began to race with the nearness of success. But as they approached the final turn that would lead them into daylight, doubt crept into his mind like poison. The footsteps behind him had grown fainter and fainter. What if she was not really there? What if Hades had played a cruel trick, sending him into the upper world alone, while Eurydice remained trapped below? "Eurydice!" he called, his voice tight with growing panic. "I am here," came the reply, but it sounded so distant now, so faint, that he could not be sure it was not simply his own hope echoing back to him. He could see sunlight ahead now, real golden sunlight streaming through the mouth of the cave. Just a few more steps, and they would both be free. But the silence behind him had grown so complete that he could not even convince himself he heard breathing. What if she had fallen? What if she had stumbled in the darkness and was lying hurt somewhere behind him? What if his certainty that she followed was nothing more than desperate wishful thinking? The doubt ate at him like acid, growing stronger with every step toward the light. He was so close now, close enough that the sunlight touched his face, warm and real and welcoming. But the silence behind him was absolute, and he could not bear the uncertainty any longer. Just at the threshold between shadow and light, with one foot already in the sunshine and freedom within reach, Orpheus turned around. For one precious moment, he saw her clearly. Eurydice stood just a few steps behind him, her hand reaching toward his back, her face bright with hope and love and the promise of life renewed. She was there. She was real. She was following him back to the world they had shared. But even as their eyes met, even as his heart soared with the confirmation that she was truly there, he saw her begin to fade. The sunlight that touched him could not quite reach her, and without its blessing, she could not cross the threshold from death to life. "No," he whispered, reaching for her even as she became translucent as morning mist. "My love," she said, her voice growing fainter even as she spoke. "You were so close. We were both so close." "I'm sorry," he cried, stretching his hand toward hers, but already she was more memory than substance. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't help it. I had to know you were there." She smiled, a smile that held no anger, no blame, only a sadness deeper than oceans. "I know," she whispered, "I know. But some gifts can only be accepted on faith alone." And then she was gone, dissolved back into shadow, returned to the realm of the dead from which she could never again be retrieved. Orpheus stood alone in the sunlight, his hand still reaching for someone who was no longer there. He played his lyre then, standing at the border between life and death, and the music that poured from him was unlike anything the world had ever heard. It was grief made manifest, love transformed into pure sound, the cry of a soul that had glimpsed paradise and lost it through its own inability to trust. The song lasted 7 days and 7 nights, and in all that time, nothing that heard it remained unchanged. Trees wept sap like tears. Rivers ran backward toward their sources. Even the stones cracked open, as if the earth itself could not bear the weight of such profound sorrow. When the song finally ended, Orpheus was different too. His hair had turned white, and his eyes held depths that spoke of having seen too much. He was still the greatest musician who had ever lived, but his music now carried the weight of ultimate loss, the knowledge that some doors, once closed, could never be opened again. He wandered the world after that, playing for any who would listen, but the joy was gone from his melodies forever. His songs were beautiful still, perhaps more beautiful than they had ever been, but they were the beauty of autumn leaves and winter stars, lovely, but touched with the certainty of endings. And in the underworld, in the quiet halls where shadows danced to music only the dead could hear, Eurydice waited with patience learned from eternity itself. She knew that someday, when his mortal life ran its course, Orpheus would come to her again. And when he did, they would have all of forever to dance together, with no need to look back, no need to doubt, no need for anything but the music they would make together in the endless twilight of the world below. The story of Orpheus reminds us that love's greatest test is not always in the grand gestures or the heroic sacrifices, but in the quiet moments when we must choose between fear and faith, between the need to know and the courage to trust. Sometimes the most profound love is proven not in looking back, but in the willingness to keep walking forward into an uncertain light. But there are other tales whispered in the shadowed halls below, other stories of struggle and endurance that echo in the eternal twilight. One such story belongs to a king who learned that even the gods can grow weary of cleverness, and that some punishments are designed not to destroy, but to teach the hardest lesson of all. In the time before time had weight, when the gods still walked among mortals, and the boundary between divine will and human ambition was as thin as morning mist, there lived a king whose cleverness was both his greatest gift and his ultimate doom. The fates had woven his thread with colors that gleamed too brightly, patterns that twisted in ways that caught the attention of powers far greater than any mortal should dare to challenge. Zeus himself watched this king from his throne on Mount Olympus, his eyes narrowing with something between admiration and annoyance. For this was no ordinary ruler who sat content with his borders and his subjects, but a man whose mind worked like quicksilver, always seeking the next advantage, the next secret to unlock, the next boundary to cross. The gods had grown comfortable in their certainty that mortals, no matter how clever, would always remain just that, mortal. Death was the great equalizer, the final word that ended every human story. But some stories, the gods were about to learn, refused to end when they were supposed to. Sisyphus ruled the great city of Corinth with the keen intelligence of a man who saw patterns others missed. His eyes were sharp as a hawk's, constantly taking in details that others overlooked. The way a merchant's hand trembled when he spoke of his wares, the way a messenger's voice changed when he delivered news from distant lands, the way the very air seemed to shift when lies were told in his presence. He had built his kingdom not through conquest or inheritance, but through wit. Where other kings relied on armies, Sisyphus relied on information. Where they used force, he used leverage. Where they threatened, he simply smiled and waited for his opponents to reveal their weaknesses. "Tell me about the stranger who arrived yesterday," he said to his captain of guards one morning as he broke his fast on bread still warm from the ovens and honey that tasted of summer meadows. "What stranger, my lord?" the captain asked, though his eyes darted away as he spoke. Sisyphus set down his cup of wine and studied the man with the patient attention of a cat watching a mouse hole. The one you tried very hard not to mention in your report. The one who asked questions about our defenses and paid for his information with gold that bears no mint marks. The captain's face went pale. He had served Sisyphus for 10 years and should have known by now that nothing happened in Corinth without the king's knowledge. But the stranger had been persuasive, and the gold had been real. "He said he was a merchant, my lord, but—" The captain trailed off, realizing that his king had already extracted the confession without even raising his voice. "But merchants do not typically carry unmarked gold or ask about guard rotations," Sisyphus finished calmly. "This stranger interests me. Bring him to the throne room, quietly." This was how Sisyphus ruled, not through fear or force, but through the simple application of intelligence to every problem that presented itself. He collected secrets the way other men collected wine or jewels, understanding that information, properly used, was more valuable than any treasure. His people prospered under this approach. Trade flourished because merchants knew that contracts made in Corinth would be honored. Crime was rare because criminals quickly learned that outwitting the king was essentially impossible. Even neighboring kingdoms found it easier to negotiate with Sisyphus than to plot against him, because he always seemed to know their intentions before they acted on them. But the gods, watching from their lofty heights, began to grow uneasy. There was something in the king's manner that suggested he might not respect the boundaries that separated mortal ambition from divine prerogative. The first sign of trouble came on a day when Thanatos, the personification of death itself, arrived in Corinth to claim the soul of a merchant who had cheated his partners once too often. Death walked through the city in the form of a tall figure shrouded in mist, invisible to all but those whose time had come. But as Thanatos approached the merchant's house, he found his path blocked by a figure he had not expected to see. "You must be Death?" Sisyphus said, pleasantly, as if greeting an old friend rather than the end of all things. "I've been wondering when you might visit our fair city." Thanatos paused, his form solidifying enough that his surprise was visible. "You can see me?" "I can see many things others cannot," Sisyphus replied. "For instance, I can see that you've come for Alexios the spice merchant, a reasonable choice given his recent business practices. But before you collect him, perhaps we might have a conversation?" Death had walked the world since the first mortal drew breath, and in all that time, no living person had ever addressed him with such casual confidence. Mortals do not bargain with death, don't they? Sisyphus tilted his head with genuine curiosity. How odd! I would have thought it the most natural thing in the world. After all, death is simply another transaction, isn't it? A life given in exchange for whatever comes next. And in any transaction, there's usually room for negotiation. There is no negotiation. When a mortal's time comes, they die. This is the natural order. Sisyphus nodded thoughtfully. The natural order, yes. I've always found that phrase fascinating. Who decided what was natural? Was it you, Zeus, the fates themselves? Despite himself, Thanatos found his attention caught by the question. It had been so long since anyone had spoken to him as an equal rather than a terror to be fled that he almost forgot why he had come. "The order was established before time began," he said carefully. "It is not mine to change." "Ah, but I'm not asking you to change it," Sisyphus said with a smile that was warm and entirely too knowing. "I'm simply asking you to help me understand it better. You see, I've always been curious about how these things work. Do you choose who dies and when? Or do you simply collect those whose names appear on some divine list? The fates determine the moment of death. I simply ensure that their will is carried out." "How fascinating. So you're rather like a bailiff, then, collecting debts owed to the cosmic order." Sisyphus gestured toward a nearby bench. "Please, sit. I find I learn so much more when I'm comfortable, and I suspect the same might be true for you." And somehow, despite every instinct that warned him against lingering, Thanatos found himself sitting beside the king of Corinth, drawn into a conversation unlike any he had ever experienced. For the first time in eons, someone was treating him not as an ending to be feared, but as a puzzle to be understood. They talked through the afternoon and into the evening. Sisyphus asked questions about the nature of death, the structure of the underworld, the relationship between the gods and the forces they claimed to control. His curiosity seemed genuine, his respect apparent. And gradually, Thanatos found himself speaking more freely than he ever had before. "You must find it lonely," Sisyphus observed, as the sun set over Corinth, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Always being the ending of every story, never the beginning of anything new." Thanatos paused, realizing that no one had ever asked him about loneliness before. "I do not think about such things." "Of course you do," Sisyphus said gently. "Everything that thinks feels. Everything that feels knows loneliness. Even gods, I suspect, though they might not admit it." They continued talking as darkness fell, and Thanatos found himself describing aspects of his existence he had never put into words. The weight of being feared by everything that lived. The isolation of being the only constant in an ever-changing world. The strange sorrow that came from ending stories that might have become beautiful if given more time. "I have something that might interest you," Sisyphus said at last, when the stars were bright overhead and the merchant they had come to discuss was long since asleep in his bed. "Something I discovered in the ruins beneath the city. Would you like to see it?" Thanatos should have refused. He had duties to perform, a cosmic order to maintain. But when had anyone ever offered to show him something they thought might interest him? When had anyone cared whether he was interested in anything at all? So he followed Sisyphus into the depths beneath the palace, down stone stairs worn smooth by centuries of use, into chambers carved from living rock. The king led him through twisting passages lit by torches that never seemed to burn down, until they reached a room dominated by a single object. It was a chain, but unlike any chain Thanatos had ever seen. The links were forged from metal that seemed to shift and flow like liquid. And when he looked at it directly, he could see glimpses of other times, other places, other possibilities reflected in its surface. "Do you know what this is?" Sisyphus asked. Thanatos approached slowly, drawn by something he could not name. "It is old, older than the gods, I think." "It's a chain forged by the Titans themselves, before Zeus cast them down. It's designed to hold concepts rather than physical forms, abstract forces, powers that have no true shape." Sisyphus's voice was soft, almost hypnotic. "I've been studying it for years, trying to understand how it works." "Why would you study such a thing?" "Because I'm curious about everything," Sisyphus replied simply. "Here, let me show you the inscription on this link. I think you might be able to read it better than I can." He held up one end of the chain, pointing to symbols carved deep into the metal. As Thanatos leaned closer to examine them, Sisyphus moved with the swift precision of a man who had planned this moment for years. The chain wrapped around Death's form like a living thing, its links fusing together with a sound like thunder contained in a whisper. Thanatos found himself bound by chains that held not his body, but his very essence, trapped as surely as if he had been turned to stone. "What have you done?" he whispered, his voice filled with shock and a growing understanding of the magnitude of what had just occurred. "I've done what no mortal has ever done before," Sisyphus said, his eyes bright with triumph. "I've captured Death himself." The implications rippled outward from that moment like waves from a stone dropped in still water. With Thanatos bound and helpless, Death stopped visiting the world. No one died, not from illness, not from injury, not from old age. Warriors struck down in battle rose again, their wounds closing as if by magic. Plague victims recovered overnight. Even those who should have died peacefully in their sleep continued to breathe, their hearts continuing to beat long past their natural span. At first, people celebrated. Who would not welcome the end of death, the promise of eternal life? But as days turned to weeks and weeks turned to months, the world began to understand what Sisyphus had wrought. Crops could not be harvested properly because the plants would not complete their natural cycle. Animals grew overcrowded and desperate as their numbers swelled beyond what the land could support. Old grudges festered when those who should have found peace in death were forced to continue their conflicts indefinitely. The natural order, it seemed, required endings as much as beginnings. In the underworld, Hades found his realm growing emptier by the day, as no new souls arrived to replace those who had served their time and moved on to whatever came after judgment. The great machinery of death and rebirth ground to a halt, and the god of the dead realized that someone had tampered with forces beyond mortal understanding. "Where is Thanatos?" he demanded of his servants, his voice echoing through halls that had grown too quiet. The answer, when it finally came, filled him with a rage that made the stones of his palace crack. A mortal, a mere human king, had dared to chain death itself, disrupting the cosmic order for his own purposes. Zeus himself descended from Olympus, his form crackling with barely contained lightning, to confront the king who had presumed to meddle with forces that even gods treated with respect. He found Sisyphus in his throne room, calmly reviewing reports from his various administrators, as if he had not just thrown the entire universe into chaos. "Release Thanatos," Zeus commanded, his voice carrying the weight of thunder. Sisyphus looked up from his scrolls with the polite attention of a host greeting an unexpected guest. "Lord Zeus, what an honor to have you visit our modest city. I trust you're finding our accommodations satisfactory." "Do not play games with me, mortal. Release death or face my wrath." "Oh, but I'm not playing games," Sisyphus replied with a smile that was both respectful and entirely too confident. "I'm conducting an experiment. You see, I've always wondered what would happen if death simply stopped. Now I know. Fascinating results, really, though I admit some of the side effects were unexpected." Zeus raised his hand, lightning beginning to gather around his fingers. "You will release him now." "Certainly," Sisyphus said with easy agreement. "But first, perhaps we might discuss terms." "Terms?" "Well, you see, I've learned something rather interesting during my experiment. Death, it seems, is not quite the implacable force we all believed him to be. He's actually rather lonely, philosophical, given to long conversations about the nature of existence. I think he rather enjoyed our time together, truth be told." Zeus's expression grew darker. "What are you suggesting?" "Simply that when I release Thanatos, and I will, of course, because I can see that his absence is causing problems, you might consider treating him with a bit more respect. Perhaps acknowledgement that he performs a service rather than simply existing as a necessary evil. It seems to me that those who serve faithfully deserve appreciation, don't you think?" For a moment, Zeus was too stunned to respond. The mortal was lecturing him, lecturing Zeus, king of the gods, about how to treat his servants. The audacity was breathtaking. But beneath the outrage, Zeus felt something else, a grudging respect for the intelligence that had conceived and executed such an impossible plan. This was no mere mortal cleverness, but something approaching divine cunning. "Very well," he said at last. "Thanatos will be accorded the respect due to one who maintains the cosmic order. Now release him." Sisyphus nodded and led the way to the chamber beneath his palace, where death waited in chains that bound concepts rather than flesh. As they descended, Zeus studied the mortal king with growing unease. This was a man who planned not just moves, but entire games ahead, who saw patterns and possibilities that even gods missed. Such intelligence, in mortal hands, was dangerous. With a word from Sisyphus, the chains dissolved like mist, and Thanatos stood free once more. But as death resumed his duties and the natural order began to reassert itself, Zeus made a decision that would echo through eternity. "Your cleverness has impressed me, Sisyphus," he said, as they climbed back toward the palace proper. But it has also shown me something troubling. You do not respect the boundaries that separate mortal ambition from divine prerogative. I respect intelligence wherever I find it, Sisyphus replied calmly, even when it challenges assumptions I've held all my life. Indeed, and that, I think, is the problem. Zeus waited until Sisyphus had lived out his natural lifespan, a span that came to its end naturally, as death resumed his duties with a newfound dignity that surprised even the god of the dead. But when the king of Corinth arrived in the underworld for judgment, Zeus was waiting for him. "Your punishment," Zeus announced, "will reflect the nature of your crime. You sought to chain the inevitable, to make progress where none was meant to be made, to achieve a goal through endless repetition of effort. Very well, you shall have your endless repetition." The punishment was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its permanence. Sisyphus would spend eternity pushing a great boulder to the top of a mountain in the underworld. Each time he reached the summit, the stone would roll back down, and he would have to begin again. "But why this particular punishment?" Sisyphus asked, his curiosity undiminished even in the face of eternal torment. "Why not simply cast me into one of the pits of punishment, or feed me to the monsters that guard your gates?" Zeus smiled, and for the first time since they had met, there was something like warmth in the expression. "Because, Sisyphus, I have come to understand that the worst punishment for a mind like yours would not be physical torment, but the complete absence of progress. You will push your stone forever, achieving nothing, advancing nowhere, learning nothing new. For a man who lived by his wits, what could be worse than eternal futility?" And so Sisyphus began his eternal task, pressing his shoulder against the rough stone, feeling its weight settle against his bones, beginning the long push up the mountainside. The first 100 times he raged against the futility of it, seeking some weakness in the stone, some flaw in the mountain that might be exploited. The next 1,000 times he fell into despair, understanding at last the true nature of his punishment. Zeus had been right. For a mind that thrived on problem-solving, on finding solutions and making progress, this endless repetition was a special kind of hell. But somewhere around the 10,000th push, something unexpected happened. As Sisyphus pressed his weight against the stone and began the familiar journey up the slope, he found himself noticing things he had missed before. The way the light fell across the mountainside changed throughout the day. The texture of the stone varied from one section to another. The path itself showed signs of wear from his countless passages. By the 100,000th push, he had begun to map these variations, to catalog the changes, to find patterns in what had seemed like meaningless repetition. The stone was not quite the same each time. The weather affected its surface, the path shifted slightly with his passing. Even the weight distribution changed as his muscles adapted to the eternal task. Zeus had intended to break his mind with futility, but instead had given him the most complex puzzle he had ever encountered, the puzzle of finding meaning in meaninglessness, purpose in repetition, progress in apparent futility. And slowly, over eons of pushing stone up an endless mountain, Sisyphus began to smile. He learned to feel the subtle differences in the stone's weight, to read the weather patterns in the underworld's eternal twilight, to find satisfaction in the perfect coordination of muscle and will required to move his burden inch by inch up the slope. Each push became not a repetition of failure, but a unique moment in an infinite series of moments. When visitors occasionally came to witness his punishment, gods checking to ensure the sentence was being carried out, or souls being shown the consequences of challenging divine will, they expected to find a broken man, crushed by the weight of endless, meaningless toil. Instead, they found Sisyphus humming as he worked, his movements efficient and practiced, his face bearing the expression of a man engaged in satisfying work. Some said his punishment had driven him mad. Others whispered that perhaps the gods had underestimated what it meant to give an eternally curious mind an eternal puzzle to solve. "Does it not torment you?" asked a newly arrived soul one day, pausing to watch as Sisyphus guided his stone around a particularly tricky curve in the path. "Torment?" Sisyphus paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "I suppose it was meant to. But I've discovered something interesting over the years." "What's that?" "The stone teaches me something new every day. The mountain shows me patterns I never noticed before. Even this punishment, designed to be meaningless, becomes meaningful if you pay enough attention to it." He placed his hands back against the stone. "Zeus thought he was condemning me to futility. Instead, he gave me the opportunity to study the nature of persistence itself. I've become an expert in a subject no one else has ever had the chance to master." The soul watched in bewilderment as Sisyphus resumed his eternal task, his movements smooth and confident, his attention focused on subtle details that others would never notice. There was something almost meditative in the way he worked, as if he had found a kind of peace in the very activity that was supposed to destroy him. "Besides," Sisyphus called over his shoulder as he continued up the mountain, "eternity is a very long time. I may be clever enough yet to find a way to make that stone stay at the top." And in the dim light of the underworld's eternal sky, as he pushed his burden toward a summit he would never permanently reach, Sisyphus continued his work with the patience of one who had learned that some victories were measured not in final achievements, but in the quality of attention brought to the task at hand. His stone rolled on under the unchanging stars, and still he pushed, finding in each moment something worth the effort, something worth understanding, something that made even eternal punishment a kind of education. For in the end, perhaps the greatest rebellion against meaninglessness was the simple act of continuing to find meaning, no matter what the gods intended. But in the shadowed halls, where punishment takes many forms, another soul had learned different lessons about the relationship between desire and satisfaction, between thirst and the promise of water just beyond reach.